On the morning of Saturday the 19th of March 1921, Commandant Charlie Hurley, OC of the Third Cork Brigade, IRA, was recovering in this farmhouse from wounds he received at Upton Ambush on the 15th of February. These photographs of the house were taken in 1984. In 1921 it belonged to the Ford family and was located at Ballymurphy near Crossbarry. Just after daybreak, a patrol of soldiers from the Essex Regiment, who were part of a larger force of British troops in the area that day, surrounded Ford's farmhouse. Charlie Hurley was upstairs in bed when he heard the soldiers approach. He had just time to put on his trousers and short coat and run down the stairs in his bare feet with his Webley revolver. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, Major A.C. Hallahan of the Essex Regiment had burst in the front door of the farmhouse, and Charlie fired, hitting him on the right side of his chest. What Charlie didn't know was that Hallahan was wearing a steel vest and the bullet only winded him. Hurley now went to escape out the back door of the farmhouse, and at this stage Hallahan had recovered and shouted to his colleagues outside to look out, and he began to follow the IRA man. Charlie ran out the door of the back kitchen attached to the farmhouse into the yard and ran towards the gate to escape. Sergeant F. Poole of the Essex gave an account of what happened next to a military inquiry later held in Bandon. And I quote, "On 19th March 1921 at about 0600 hours, I was the NCO with Major Hallahan's party which surrounded a farm belonging to a Mr. Ford. At about 0630 hours I went around to the back door while Major Hallahan approached the front door to enter the house. I heard several shots fired almost immediately in-house. A few moments afterwards a man rushed out at the back door close to where I was standing and fired at me as he came out. I fired back and shot him dead in the head. We searched the body but found nothing to identify him, but found a Webley revolver in his right hand with 4 fired cartridges in the chamber and 2 live rounds. He also had 19 cartridges in his pocket and some documents. F. Poole, Sergeant." End quote. The soldiers didn't know it that morning, but they had just shot the most senior officer of the IRA in West Cork, Charlie Hurley. Hurley's body was taken from Ford's yard in a cart to Crossbarry and put into a lorry with the 3 IRA men who were shot dead in Crossbarry Ambush the same morning. The 4 bodies were left in an open yard in the military barracks in Bandon for a couple of days, and it is thought that this is a photograph of the bodies, with Charlie Hurley's body being the one without boots. The 3 other IRA casualties were Con Daly from Carrickballinascarthy, Peter Monaghan, who was born in Scotland, and Jeremiah O'Leary from Cornlep. On the Monday afternoon, after being put into a coffin made of cheap white boards, the body of Charlie Hurley was taken to the workhouse in Bandon. There it was removed from the coffin by Babe Crowley and other nurses. The body of a patient who had just died was put into Hurley's coffin, and the Commandant's body was smuggled out and put into a horse cart which belonged to Rick Regan. Rick, accompanied by Mary O'Mahony, drove out of Bandon with their precious cargo, and after a nervous journey went in the long lane into Rick Regan's farmyard in the townland of Garandruig. It may have been there that the remains of Charlie Hurley were put into a proper coffin for the funeral. Eventually, well after midnight, Rick Regan's cart crossed the main Timoleague Bandon Road at Kilchinhan Crossroads and headed over Buckley's Bridge towards Clogagh village. The cart stopped in front of the church of St. Maluda, and the coffin was shouldered into the church by members of the IRA Flying Column, who had won a huge victory against the British at Crossbarry just a few days before. Led by Tom Barry and Liam Deasy, they had marched over 15 miles to Clogagh from their billets at O'Sullivan's Gran Riach, west of Bernablaw, to be in Clogagh for the funeral of their brigadier. Some historians believe that when the priest in the presbytery at Clogagh was called at 1 o'clock in the morning to come over to the church to say mass, he was afraid, and that Tom Barry himself had to go to his house and persuade him to do so. The local sacristan, Jane O'Donovan, had prepared the church for mass. She hid arms and ammunition in Clogagh Church during the War of Independence. What a sight it must have been that night in Clogagh Church, with Charlie Hurley's coffin in front of the altar and at least 40 armed members of the Flying Column in the church, as well as local members of the IRA, some of whom were on sentry duty outside. Only 6 other mourners were present. After Mass, as the coffin was brought out, Fleur Begley was already warming up his war pipes, which he had played in Harold's yard as Crossbarry Ambush raged around him a few days before. The men of the Flying Column in their turns shouldered Charlie Hurley's coffin and followed Fleur Begley as he played laments on the pipes for over a mile until they reached the ancient graveyard of Clogagh. There, in moonlight, which appeared and disappeared with passing clouds, a woman took out the breastplate from under her coat and it was screwed onto the coffin, which was lowered into the grave. Another woman stepped forward and handed a jar to one of the men, which he also placed in the grave. It contained brain matter recovered from the spot at Ballymurphy where Charlie Hurley had died. More prayers were said. The Flying Column commander Tom Barry spoke a few words at the graveside. A volley of shots were fired by the IRA over the remains of their OC, and the grave was filled in. The Flying Column moved away quickly that morning from Clogagh, as they had to cross the dangerous main Clonakilty-Bandon road before daybreak. At the time of his death, Charlie Hurley was about to propose marriage to a senior officer of the Commandant named Leslie Price, who had served in the GPO in Dublin in 1916. Some historians believe that Leslie Price was standing next to Charlie Hurley's grave during the funeral and was comforted by Tom Barry, who presented her with a strip of the tricolour which had been on the coffin. However, other historians think that she was not in the graveyard that night. Tom Barry did become engaged to Leslie Price afterwards, and they were married on the 22nd of August 1921 during the truce. This famous photograph of the wedding party was taken in the back garden of Vaughan's Hotel in Parnell Square in Dublin. A commemoration took place in Clogagh Graveyard on the first anniversary of Charlie Hurley's death, and this is a photograph of the firing party taken that day. The fine Celtic cross that we are familiar with over Charlie Hurley's grave in Clogagh was unveiled by former OC of the Third Cork Brigade, Commandant Liam Deasy, on Sunday the 18th of August 1963. In this photograph we see Liam Deasy, Con Crowley and other former comrades of Charlie Hurley around the newly unveiled cross. This is a photograph of the attendants in Clogagh that day. On that occasion also, a party from Clonakilty FCA fired 3 volleys over the grave of a never-to-be-forgotten fallen IRA officer, Commandant Charlie Hurley.
Hark, I will tell you of a hero who rallied the forces of Erin on hillside and lawn, when the brutal invader had crushed and dismayed them, and long they had slumbered, awaiting the dawn. Yet true to their birthright these brave hearts re-echoed the pulse of the dead that no tyrant could slay. The foremost of all in the battle's red lighting, with the boys from West Cork, was this man from Borley. As the grey dawn of morning stole over the green hills, whilst wounded a while in seclusion he lay, those merciless foemen drew fiercely around him, whilst his boys unsuspecting were deep in the fray. But he gallantly fought as they pulled in around him, and soon his 2 rivals were lying at his feet. But in dashing away deadly guns from an outpost, still the bravest of hearts that for freedom did beat.